Well, on today's program, we're asking, where do atheists get their meaning? Zach Broom is the author of Without God, Science, Belief, Morality, and the Meaning of Life, in which he says that without God, none of those things really make sense. With God, they do. And he dedicated this book to his friend Mike. And it's that Mike, Michael Brady, in fact, who is in conversation with him today. Mike is an atheist, a long-time listener of The Unbelievable Show, and one of the contributors, actually, to the Still Unbelievable response book to my own book a couple of years ago. Chapter 8 of Zach's book is titled The Meaning of Life. And we're going to be having a conversation on whether life has a meaning and where we get it from if there is no God. So welcome along to the program, Zach and Mike. Great to have you both with me. Doing this as usual from lockdown conditions, but tell me where you're both beaming in from today. Perhaps we'll start with you, Zach. Where are you coming from?
Breezy Point, Minnesota. I'm actually in my office at church, which is kind of an exception for most people right now. I can kind of get up here, get away from the kids at home, which it's nice being with, but they're pretty distracting at times, as I'm sure you're aware of, Justin.
I get that. We're all in the same boat when it comes to these, trying to work under unusual conditions. You're a pastor, so we've guessed that much about you, Zach. So tell us about that. What's the current lockdown doing for you, and how are you kind of conducting your services at the moment?
We were pre-recording and then doing like fake live, basically. And then we started doing live once I was comfortable enough with the tech. It's a pretty small church, so I've only been here since October. But now we're actually doing drive-in church on Sunday, so people can drive in, stay in their cars 6 feet apart, roll their windows down. And
interesting.
Makeshift stage setup.
Like those old school drive-in movie things,
right,
where you'd have the big screen. Great. That's an interesting way of doing things. Michael, welcome along to the show as well. We've known each other on and off in a way over email for a long time. You've been a regular emailer into the show, but tell me, just how long have you been listening to The Unbelievable Show, Michael?
I started in 2009 listening to the program.
Wow.
I believe it was an episode with PZ Myers, and I was directed to the episode from an atheist or skeptical website. Listened to it, and I ditched PZ immediately and became a big fan of your program, and have been listening to it ever since.
Wow. There you go. Yeah, you must be one of the, a pretty long time listener on that basis, over 10 years now. I think that's how actually, especially in the sort of early years of the podcast, it really grew, was through people simply sharing it on blogs and so on. When a well-known personality like a PZ Myers came on, suddenly I would find a new wave of atheist listeners had joined the ranks of downloading the show, which is fantastic. And I'm so glad that you've been keeping contact. And of course, wrote one of the chapters, I think, in the Still Unbelievable book. Just remind us what that project was and what your particular contribution to it was.
Well, when your book came out, first of all, we're all fascinated to read it. I think most folks know that you have a dedicated fan base that includes atheists, agnostics, and non-believers. When your book came out, one of the ideas, we're batting the idea around of having a response book, much like other authors have, written a pro book and then had a con book written afterwards. And then the chapter that I volunteered for was, making sense of morality without God. So sort of along the lines of discussions that Zach and I had all along. It was a fascinating enterprise, being his first and only chapter in a book I've ever been involved in as well.
So in an ironic way, it was actually an atheist who introduced you, Zach, to the program, because I think it was your friendship with Mike that led to you also becoming an unbelievable listener. But tell me how where your friendship goes back to with Mike, Zach.
Goes back to when I was in seminary. I got a job doing overnight security, and every once in a while, he was my boss, and he had to fill in shifts when people called in sick or whatever. And when I first met him, I thought he was a Christian because he was talking about religion, the books he'd like to read. And I was like, wow, this guy knows a lot. And he's like, oh, no, I'm not a Christian. I was like, whoa, what is this? So actually, Mike not only introduced me to Unbelievable, he actually introduced me to just reading in general. I was like 23 at the time, probably. This goes back pretty far. So I'm 36 now. So yeah, we've known each other for a long time. I found that Mike knew more about religion than a lot of the Christians that I knew. and he had good questions that I didn't have answers to, which got me into reading C.S. Lewis, which I named my son after Lewis, which is how big of a fan I am of C.S. Lewis, because he had such an impact on my life. And so, yeah, Mike, good friend,
that's
very
interesting.
influential.
So up to that point, even up to the point where you were starting at seminary, you hadn't really done a lot of investigation into apologetics and the evidence for Christianity and so on. So you've got Mike to thank, obviously, for bringing you on that journey.
Yep.
What's that journey look like for you? Because you say at the beginning of this book, Without God, that you've always been a doubter in some ways.
Mm-hmm.
So did that kind of shake you at the time when Mike came into your life and started asking, probing questions about your faith?
A little bit. I was already kind of wrestling through some things. The problem of evil has always been something that, depending on the day, really bothers me, especially going back then before I really kind of worked through that a bit. So, yeah, Mike kind of came along, asked some questions that I didn't know the answers to. I went on the internet, started watching debates. This was back with like Matt Dillahunty. I remember watching him in his early days, probably 2006. And I remember getting that kind of feeling in your chest, like, I don't know the answer to this, where it's kind of a panic feeling.
Yeah.
But thankfully, that just inspired me to keep researching and reading and learning more. And yeah, it's been great. It's I would say Mike's skepticism has it has affected my faith and made it stronger through our friendship than even seminary did, I would say, for sure. So
that's really interesting to hear. Yeah. And what about you, Mike? How long would you have defined as an atheist, or indeed do you define in that way?
Well, when you use the term, my first thought was I'm a non-believer, but atheist is a very loaded term, both among atheists and believers.
Mm-hmm.
I was raised Roman Catholic, but at the same time, my maternal grandmother was a devoted attendee of Norway Lutheran Church in rural North Dakota. So not only did we go to mass once a week, we also, if there was time and we got back early, we'd also go to church with our other grandmother. So
a double dose. Wow.
Double dose, which didn't bother me. I just thought it was a little redundant, perhaps. But even then, there was not doubt, but just I was aware of friction between the two beliefs. Here were two women that I loved, adored completely and trusted, in every way. And yet they believed different things about God and the church and the role of worship and all that sort of thing. And I found that fascinating, but most of the time I was living in a Roman Catholic household, so we did it that way. I went into sort of, I guess, what people call now a period of deconstruction in my college years. And unlike some folks who come out of it with a stronger faith or a reassembled belief system, my faith fell away. And people speak of the God-shaped hole and that sort of thing. I grasp that concept. I get it. On their days, I feel it. But after doing extensive study, I didn't find anything to reconstruct or to refill it. But I have come away with a really strong appreciation, fascination with the religious impulse. Mm-hmm. What is it that makes us religious? I think it's inherent in the way we perceive the world.
Okay. Well, we could dig into that a bit in the course of the discussion. Yeah, because I think that'll be very relevant to the topic we've sort of decided on for today's program, which is meaning. I've asked the rather cheeky question: where do atheists get their meaning from? And we'll be asking you both in a way where you get your meaning from and how you see the other person's point of view. Zach, give us a bit of an overview of the book itself, because it's obviously not just meaning that it deals with. There's a whole range of areas. So yeah, sketch out for us what you're doing with this particular book.
The short version of it is, instead of trying to just set up and prove that God exists, which is probably what I believed back when I first started having conversations with Mike, I'm trying to show that Christianity explains our basic intuitions in the best way. These intuitions we have, like love, meaning, beauty, morality. Whereas atheism, which is a loaded term, so I'm mainly dealing with humanism in the book, the evolutionary psychology, this idea that evolution explains all these things. And I'm trying to show that when you contrast Christianity with atheistic humanism, Christianity is just the better explanation. It's the better worldview. We all have to pick a worldview, which is kind of like a lens by which we interpret all of the information that we both have access to. And I think Christianity is a better explanation for reality as we experience it.
Okay. And so you take that through these various chapters, the
Right.
ways in which you, in a way, there's a great deal of overlap between my book as well, actually, where I took a very similar approach certainly in the first few chapters of the book as well. But
yeah, I just finished your book this week, and I was like,
there you go.
There's a lot of similarities here.
Well, look, great stuff. We've set the topic up nicely there. Specifically, we want to talk about meaning, and that's chapter 8 of your book. It's titled "The Meaning of Life." I mean, it has been said that we're in a crisis of meaning by some people. You look at things like the suicide rate currently among young men in the West has been going up quite significantly. When you look at the statistics around mental health issues, depression, and so on, again, there seems to have been a real spike in the last, since the beginning of this millennium, I suppose. I wonder what you both put that down to, whether you think there is a so-called crisis of meaning for people currently. Maybe start with you, Mike. What do you think of that idea of there being a crisis of meaning?
Yeah, I think there are certainly challenges in modern life. I'm not sure that we in the West have figured it all out. Like you said, if we measure it by mental health issues or substance abuse or health issues, yeah, we don't seem to be as happy as we ought to be. But I think it's probably a question of constant change. We're having this meeting over technology that didn't exist, 5 years ago, let alone 50 when I was 10 years old and figuring out, what was going to happen to the rest of my life. So I think technology drives change. I think the rate of change, the idea that, here I am, I'm communicating with my friend over the internet and I haven't seen him in person for 6 months. We used to know the people we knew. We used to visit them. We used to talk to them every day. And I think we've lost some of that in the modern race to wherever it is we're going. It's not always satisfying. And in some cases, like you pointed out, it's actually dangerous for us.
I mean, I suppose it was a leading question as much as I might be tempted to ask, is it because we are increasingly less religious in the West that to some extent we've lost a sense of meaning? And you said at the beginning, you think we are inherently religious. So I don't know. What do you think? Is there a sort of part of us that does look for that sort of meaning in that kind of transcendent reality of a God and the purpose that might bring to people's lives and so on?
I think we intuit that there's something like that out there. And some people take the time and trouble to go find it and to develop it and to become pastors and, talk show hosts. But I guess part of the issue is that not all Christians aren't immune from the suicidal stresses and the alcohol.
Absolutely. Yeah, sure.
Things, right? People have unhappy lives in all faiths, as close as I can tell, unless they reach a pretty high level of mastery, perhaps in Buddhism. But everyone's got stresses, and I do as well. Is it because I abandoned my faith 40 years ago? Doesn't feel like it. Is it, and are people hurting because their faith isn't, real or real enough or supportive enough for them? I don't know. But there are other people who, I've met people who seem to be bereft, seem sort of independent of whether or not they have a religious upbringing or a religious philosophy. But there are also, the counterpoint is that there are more happy people, more comfortable people in the world than there are people, that we're speaking about, who feel aimless. I mean, a lot of people have a pretty good idea what they're doing, at least on a day-by-day basis. Or stages of their lives, supporting families and that sort of thing.
What about yourself, Zach? This crisis of meaning that I've referenced, how do you see that? And would you have a similar diagnosis as Michael has there of the fact that, could be down to many things, the rapid advance of technology and so on, and we don't tend to see a lot of difference between different tribes, Christians or non-Christian, when it comes to the way that, you know, these issues tend to impact them and so on.
I wouldn't disagree with Mike's answer, but I would say it's a partial answer. Mike, you mentioned at the beginning, you brought up the God-shaped hole, and obviously we're going to go there when we talk about the meaning of life. The way I see our culture is it's not a non-Christian culture in the West primarily. It's, you know, it's followed Europe's path, which is primarily a post-Christian culture. And so what we're trying to do is take our lives and understand it by a completely new narrative, which isn't satisfying. You know, it's not giving us the existential answer about the meaning of life. What is truly valuable, right? Because I don't think internet itself and all these kind of things, which definitely bring new obstacles that we have to deal with, is the primary problem. I think we're trying to fill the God-shaped hole with pleasures, with things in this life that were never meant to fill that hole. And so when we try to do that, it's like trying to run a car off of Mountain Dew or something, or trying to become satiated by drinking salt water. You know, it's not going to work.
What leads you, Zach, to believe there is this God-shaped hole? And you're obviously quoting in a way from Blaise Pascal there. I don't know if you've got the original quote to hand, but
I don't.
It's something along the lines of, there is a God-shaped hole within the heart of every human being, and it can only be filled by God made known through Jesus Christ. I think I'm probably butchering it slightly there, but yes, I mean, he popularized this phrase. But what leads you to believe that he was right about that, Zach?
About there being a God-shaped hole, or just about there being a hole and we all have to fill it? Because even atheists will agree that we're all putting something at the center of our lives that we're living for. I can't remember Dawkins' exact quote. I'm not saying Mike is a Dawkins protege or anything, but it's pretty much universally
shaking
realized.
his head, by the way, at that point.
Yeah.
For those who aren't.
When we first met and started talking, I started coming at him with this Dawkins stuff. He's like, Dawkins ain't my boy, you know, like don't stamp me with Dawkins' beliefs. But it's universally agreed upon that we all are living for something. And so whatever that something is, it comes down to, does that thing have intrinsic value or extrinsic value? Because if it only has an extrinsic value, I don't see how that is something that we can live our lives off of, something that can actually give us meaning, especially when we face so much suffering in this world. Death, every loved one that we have is going to die someday. Those relationships are going to be severed. Everything that we could possibly live for that's not God is over time going to go away. It's going to disintegrate. So I would say universally, people have recognized this is a problem. This leads to depression in a lot of people, misery, anxiety. So how do we deal with it? What do we put at the center driving force of our life? And the Christian answer has been, you know, going back even to Judaism, which is love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and then love your neighbor as yourself. And as you do that, when you center everything else in your life around that belief, then those other things actually have a place. But when you try to substitute that center belief with these other good things, but aren't intrinsically good things, that's where you run into problems. That's where you run into the society that we have today, where it's like, hey, hedonism doesn't work. Living for pleasures, living for, you know, whatever, isn't going to cut it.
And I wonder whether that's why we've seen, interestingly, the popularity of figures like Jordan Peterson and others,
right,
who have kind of come on the coattails of the new atheism and aren't exactly themselves conventional believers by any stretch of the imagination, but seem to be drawing a big crowd saying, we've got to find meaning again. We've got to find purpose again. We you know, this technology is going to eat us alive if we don't kind of understand what we're here for, and that kind of thing. And sounding almost at times like, you know, a preacher or an apologist. So it's an interesting time, isn't it? I mean, coming back to you though, Mike, what do you make of Zach's diagnosis of the God-shaped hole in all of us?
I think, well, first of all, I agree. We most of us have one if we care to look. But the idea that we fill it with hedonism or nihilism or whatever doesn't ring true to me. There's another book I've been working on, reading, Jennifer Michael Hecht's The Happiness Myth, where the idea that the modern concept of happiness as a result of material wealth or goods or whatever, or shiny objects, isn't the way most people have looked at the role in life, or the best purpose in life over time, that it's one of service, that it's one of excellence, or life of virtue. And the idea that we can love our neighbor and care for our community, and and ideally as much as we care for ourselves, is what a lot of us do. My life's been one of service in a variety of settings. So is Zach's. So is yours. But the question is, can I have that service? Can I have that virtue, a virtuous life, without believing that God is the one providing it?
Well, indeed. And obviously, I assume you do believe you can have that without having to have God. I suppose, what's your response to that? Because it is a typical kind of a response to the question of purpose and meaning and morality as well, Zach. Well, yeah, we all want to do the right thing and have meaningful lives, but I seem to be able to be getting on having a meaningful life without needing God as part of the puzzle, if you like. What's your response to that?
I would say that your worldview is going to dictate whether or not you're going to be able to find meaning. So, for instance, Mike, let me ask you, what would you say is the primary purpose and meaning of your life as an unbeliever? Somebody who doesn't believe in God or look to God to get that, you'd say it's
service to my family and to community.
Okay, and so how would you say that is not overcome by the deafening finality of the grave, right? Because death wipes all that away. One of the illustrations I use in the chapter on it is basically pretend you're sitting around with your family. You receive news that a nuke is coming. It's going to hit you. You've got 30 minutes left to live or whatever. How do you spend those last 30 minutes living with meaning? Well, the way I see it, according to your worldview, Mike, it would be, let's go out and help poor people. Let's feed them. People are hungry. Let's make their last 30 minutes of their life as significant as possible, and that will provide meaning. In which I would say, I don't think that does. It's going to be wiped out in 30 minutes, so what's the point?
And I remember when I read that section in your book thinking, if that were happening to me and my family and my friends, I would not run out and feed the neighborhood. I would give hugs and kisses and comfort to the people around me. So the idea, I think sometimes, just like I'm not Dawkins' boy, I wear the label humanist pretty lightly as well. The example of what do you do with the next 30 minutes? It's a good one. But the question that comes back to me is, I look at, the life of purpose, believe in the better story, that you lay out very nicely in the book. You can live out the better story, even if it's not true. You do all the right things as a result of believing the story. And I guess that's part of what I believe, the religion of Christianity, Judaism, Hinduism, that sort of thing, Islam, is narrative, and it shapes people's lives and gives them meaning. You do have non-believers, an atheist on their back foot a little bit when you say, well, I've got a plan already set up for me by God, and you don't. I was like, okay, got me there. But I see it's one of the reasons I don't have trouble, so to speak. Some atheists have, just loathe the idea of religious people or religious concepts or thoughts. I don't, as long as they're caring for other people and being kind.
And in saying that, you don't sound at all anti-religious in that sense, and hence why you're not a P.Z. Myers or a Dawkins boy and so on, Michael, clearly. But I guess, what's the point for you here then of this analogy, though, that this little example you bring up in the book of, if you had 30 minutes left and then it was everything was wiped out, what would you be doing with your 30 minutes, I guess, would be my next question, Zach. And why does the way it hits you, why is it significantly different as far as you can see from a Michael who doesn't believe there's anything beyond that that 30 minutes in the future?
Because for meaning to matter, it can't just be momentary. Something actually has to have been accomplished, right? So for the Christian, we would believe, well, I'm going to pray. I'm going to hug my family as well, like Mike said he would. But this isn't the end. I'm going to see you again shortly hereafter, right? Like there's the afterlife, there's God. Whereas for the non-believer, there's nothing. It's eternal blackness. There's no existence whatsoever. So it doesn't matter how you spend those 30 minutes. Once those 30 minutes are up, it's not going to change a single thing. I mean, scientists have known for a while now that the universe is winding down. It's eventually going to be a void of nothingness. So when that comes, what difference will it have made if you helped grandma across the street or stole the money in her purse? The net outcome is still the same. You know, it's like trying to spend all of your life building a sandcastle on the beach and making it the most important thing ever, knowing that the tide's coming in a few hours and going to wipe the whole thing out. And it doesn't matter how nice that sandcastle was. It doesn't change anything. And for the Christian, there's an eternal change that affects everything forever.
Well, if I can at least wear Dawkins for a moment, his hat. I mean, the answer I might anticipate from Dawkins, as he's given in some of his books, is the universe doesn't care. You know, maybe we are just making it up as we go along. And maybe there is actually, in the end, none of it will matter. But that's just life, and it doesn't prove God. That is the answer I would anticipate if Dawkins was in the room right now.
And well, Dawkins says, I'm trying to remember the quote. He says, for him, a good dose of science, curiosity, being willing to answer hard questions is how he finds meaning in life. So he answers it how you said, but he also then in the same breath turns to things that he finds meaningful.
Right.
He says these aren't intrinsically meaning, but he's talking in a way, and most atheists I find do, where they're saying, yes, this doesn't have intrinsic meaning. Nihilism is partly true, but really we can give meaning to our lives. Yes, the universe is meaningless. There's no purpose, but we can subjectively give it meaning, which doesn't really work, because if you're assigning subjective meaning, you're saying that there is a part of the universe that really does matter, and it's the part within me that makes these subjective determinations of what has meaning and doesn't. So it's kind of contradictory is the way I see it. Okay.
Well, we're going to have to go to a break, and then I'll be interested to hear Michael's response to that. And I'm going to pull out a quote or two from this chapter as well that we're discussing from your book, Zach. The book is called, by the way, Without God, Science, Belief, Morality, and the Meaning of Life. I'll make sure there's a link to it from today's show. You can also find more about my other guest. He is Mike. He's the person the book is dedicated to, Michael Brady, and we'll be continuing this conversation on where do atheists get their meaning here on Unbelievable very shortly.
What I want to invite Roger to comment on is, why couldn't the mental realm include an infinite consciousness?
It's too much like us. It's too much like putting it like the Greek views of the gods in some sense. They were too much like us.
They were finite and contingent. Here we're talking about a metaphysically necessary source.
I admire this noble aspiration to find the highest possible ideal. It's almost as if you're proposing a new religion to meet this new challenge.
It's not a new religion. Yes. What it is something that sits in the same place. It addresses some of the same needs, but it is not founded on the same principle.
If the New Testament says that Jesus did X, Y, and Z, did he do it or not?
I don't think it's a story that's made by committee. Am I going to have a later literary genius who comes up with a great story like this? Or am I going to say, no, Jesus is the genius, and somehow that story has basically been preserved?
Welcome back to today's edition of the show. Where do atheists get their meaning is the question we're talking about today. Long-time show listener Michael Brady is with us today. He's a non-believer, an atheist. That's a loaded term, he says. He's not this or that particular type of atheist, but anyway, he's been explaining to us where he stands on the issues today. And in conversation with his friend, Zach Broom, who has authored this book, Without God, Science, Belief, Morality, and the Meaning of Life. And we're specifically talking about the meaning of life on today's program. Big kind of question to tackle. But we've already asked, is there a God-shaped hole? And what do we do with the fact that on an atheistic, naturalistic worldview, there will be an ultimate end to everything? And whatever you did, good or bad in the world, it'll all come out the same in the end. And I wanted to throw this to you, Mike, as we come back to you. One quote in that chapter from Zach is from Stephen Jay Gould, a well-known biologist, who says, "We are here because one odd group of fishes had a peculiar fin anatomy that could transform into legs for terrestrial creatures, because comets struck the Earth and wiped out dinosaurs, thereby giving mammals a chance not otherwise available. We may yearn for a higher answer, but none exists. This explanation, though superficially troubling, if not terrifying, is ultimately liberating and exhilarating. We cannot read the meaning of life passively in the facts of nature. We must construct these answers for ourselves." Is that a quote you could, by and large, put your name to, Mike? I know there's a few by Peter Wise and Dawkins you couldn't, but what about that one?
Right. No, Stephen Jay Gould put it together very nicely. When you said, we're the result of these happy accidents and or tragedies for dinosaurs, my first thought was, and isn't that fascinating? Isn't that wonderful? The idea, I think it was Sagan who said something to the effect of, we're stardust. We're the universe made manifest, trying to understand itself. And I think about that and I go, whoa, that's good for a couple of weeks of deep thinking. And it fills me with a sort of awe that I would have described as religious back when I was a believer. But this idea that, what happens when it's all over, it's like, we're just getting started. Yes, the universe has a destiny of winding down to nothingness or spreading out into nothingness. But until it's over, it ain't over. So the idea of what can we become? What else can, we as sentient beings, as a manifestation of literally the universe, attain in time? And it goes off into the realm of science fiction. If you say, well, maybe our task, our goal is to survive this heat death of the universe, to find a way to step outside it. Once we have the ability to do that, and again, this is all pretty serious science fiction stuff, we could create our own universe. And what does that make us? Very similar to whoever created this universe. And yeah, so that's again.
Or like the dinosaurs, we could be wiped out by a stray comet tomorrow.
We absolutely could. No one guaranteed that we're the only ones, or that we're not guaranteed to be successful.
Yeah. But okay. But overall, obviously, Mike agree. Think Stephen Jay Gould put it pretty well there. We are happy accidents in a way, but we're here. Let's make the most of it. We're not going to be wiped out tomorrow, as far as we know. So let's do what we can with what we've got. What's wrong with that kind of approach, I guess, to the question of, do we have meaning in our lives, Zach?
I don't think it can actually bring us meaning. It's saying there's no meaning, but we can give it meaning, doesn't mesh. I mean, the shadow of the axe hangs over every joy. So knowing that everything is going to end, and it doesn't matter what you did. I mean, I look at, like the myth of Sisyphus. Like, Sisyphus is condemned by the gods to roll the boulder uphill for all eternity, which is really a good picture of us. If all we're doing is rolling a boulder up that's going to roll right back down and accomplish nothing, how does that give us any real meaning that matters? We can say it gives us meaning, even though our worldview, from the naturalistic humanistic worldview, says there isn't no meaning. To me, it just doesn't, it's a contradiction, and I like what Mike was kind of getting at with, maybe we'll be able to outlive heat death. Well, that's the Christian answer. We will outlive the heat death. So you're getting closer to it.
Well, that's an interesting point. I mean, the myth of Sisyphus, I probably mispronouncing that, but I found that an interesting little point in your chapter. As you say, it's this Greek myth of Sisyphus, I think I'm pronouncing it right, condemned to roll this boulder uphill, and then it simply rolls back down again, and this never-ending toil. And other philosophers have tried to suggest, well, maybe there is some way of giving Sisyphus some meaning in all of this. Maybe he's rolling many stones up a hill and creating a beautiful temple, or maybe the gods can sort of enchant him in some way to believe that this is a wonderful activity and gives his life lots of meaning. Is there a way to make sense of Sisyphus's dilemma, his that endless thing? I suspect that some atheists would want to say, look, yeah, even if there's no ultimate point to this, we can have our own little points of meaning in it, and we can build our temples or enjoy the task that we are set in front of us, even if it doesn't have any eternal consequence. Zach?
Yeah, that's a good question. Are you asking Mike?
I was going to ask Zach first and then see what Mike has to say. Yeah.
You get into, and all this intertwines. It gets back to the morality issue too, meaning, objective truth versus subjective truth. What if my meaning in life is sadism, right? Like just inflicting as much pain on people, as I can. And that's how I find true meaning. Well, all of our intuitions tell us, no, that's not right. You may enjoy napalming babies just for fun, but that's garbage. I like Eric Wellenberg. He's an atheist who wrote a book, Value and Virtue in a Godless Universe. And he was, I reached out to him while I was researching and writing the book, and he was very helpful, kind of pointing me directions to read things. But he's got a chapter where he talks about the myth of Sisyphus, which is really helpful because Eric believes in objective moral truth, right? He's kind of in the rare camp here when it comes to atheists. But he says, imagine if Sisyphus was condemned to eat excrement for all of eternity, but the gods gave him, they were kind gods, and they instilled within him a love for eating excrement. He just loves doing it all day and all night. And he's like, this man should be pitied. This is a horrible existence compared to a Sisyphus who is condemned to play piano for the gods for all eternity. And what Eric is getting at, and I think is absolutely true, which we intuitively recognize value in things. We recognize that eating excrement for all of eternity is not a good use of your life. The same way that being a sadist is objectively wrong. It's not a beautiful thing. Beauty has a subjective element, but the ground floor of beauty is objective truth. It's objective reality. And so when we reject that and start to say, well, I can just give it whatever meaning I want. Okay, well, is that free for anything? Can we say that hurting and harming people is a good way to find meaning in your life? And if the answer is no, what is it up here that is coming down to say, no, you can't do that? You can do it this way, but you can't do it that way. And so in an atheistic universe, or a naturalistic universe, I should say, to be more fair to Mike, how do you deal with that?
Yeah. What do you do with this fact that we do intuitively seem to believe that some forms of meaning are less valuable than others, even if people go about in their life insisting that their meaning is the best one, the sadist? We might be inclined to say, no, I think you've got the wrong idea there, Mike. What would be your response?
Unless we go off into the issue around sources of morality and that sort of thing, I'd say, first of all, a sadist is a malfunctioning social animal. And society has ways of dealing with people who are malfunctioning that badly as to cause harm to people. But I keep going back to the myth of Sisyphus for two reasons. One, it's a myth. It helps us understand something we're supposed to be working on. But the other part of the myth, the story, is that let's not forget a god assigned this task to Sisyphus. Someone decided this is what you're going to do for eternity as a punishment, if I recall the myth correctly. But I guess I'd ask Zach, can purpose be assigned? How is having the creator of the universe decide what you're going to do for all eternity better than you deciding what to do with your entire life? If we believe the psalmist, some of us are destined to sing the praises of the Almighty in heaven forever and ever and ever. What if we want to play the flute? What if we want to play the harp? What if we'd rather be doing something else? The idea that that God can assign this to us doesn't automatically make it better for me. The idea that, well, if God loves us and we love him and we return to him in the way described, or wished for, that it'll all be great. But I don't know what that means. And I don't know what that looks like. And I agree that, there are probably biblicists who would say, no, it says it in the Psalms, that's what I'll be doing. I'll be the third person in the second row, singing forever. But just the idea was that their idea of what worship would be like, of what adoration and being in that loving relationship would be like? Probably. So as you can imagine, I'm not a biblical literalist either. So
I would say, so why can God assign meaning to us and we can't? Well, if we try to, if I try to take scissors, like normal kitchen scissors, and try to start cutting sheet metal with it, I'm going to damage the scissors. It's not what it was created for. So if God creates something for a specific purpose, and this God is good, which obviously Christians believe, he alone is going to understand how humans flourish, how they function best. But at the same time, Mike, you're doing the same thing, because you will look at the sadist and say, no. That's not how you get to determine value and meaning and purpose in your life. And yeah, I would agree with you. A sadist is mentally ill at best, right? Like there's problems going on there. But at the same time, that's an objective statement. It's putting a value judgment on that person. And in a naturalistic universe, how do I do that? I mean, nature is red in tooth and claw. Like, it's not a pretty thing. So if I'm going to say that the sadist who's a human doesn't get to act like the rest of these animals because they have language and they can understand suffering, where is that objective claim grounded in?
Probably the same place Eric Wielenberg grounds it. That's one of the books you recommended I read back when we were exchanging ideas back in the day. But the idea of morality as an objective truth, as a brute fact of the universe. I hadn't realized it. You pointed it out when we met over lunch a couple of months ago that, oh my God, you believe in objective moral truth. And I go, yeah, you're right, I do.
Which is quite the change from our first conversations, because you were a subjective moralist. So
exactly.
Oh, well, you've moved him a little bit then, Zach, in all those years.
He's just 2 steps from believing in Jesus. We're almost there.
So the
I don't want to digress too much, but what made you change your mind on that one then, Michael?
I think part of it, I think it came together when I wrote the chapter in the response book. It's the idea of, I believe we have universal moral truths, and I believe in many ways all sorts of social animals have been living by them for millions of years, not just the hundreds of thousands of years humanity's been around. And what's different about the behavior is that we've got the language to talk about it and the brains to muse on it. But we can no more walk up to our brother or sister at a family gathering and punch him in the face as an orangutan can, because we know it's wrong. We know it's that we wouldn't want anyone doing it to us. We know we'll be punished. And I think a lot of, and there's social behaviors into much simpler animals. And I think most of us, other than the sad examples of sadists and torturers and that sort of thing, sociopaths, again, are a malfunctioning sort of human being. If they have no empathy, they're not really they're a poor example of humanity. But I guess I don't know where else to take that, but essentially.
But what you're describing is, essentially, yes, an objective way of looking at morality and meaning. And in that sense, I think the question that you seem to have then for Zach is, well, where does that come from ultimately? Is it now, Zach, presumably you believe it's hard for an atheist to have those sorts of objective views about morality and ethics without there being some transcendent source for that. Now, you've both obviously been influenced by Eric Wielenberg, who I would love to have on the show at some point as well, actually. But where does he ground it as far as you see, Zach, and what's your concern with the way he does it then?
So Eric and I ground our beliefs on transcendent truths in the same place. It's a self-evident truth. it's a properly basic belief. Alvin Plantinga is probably my go-to on Reformed epistemology. He's got a really good book dealing with it, but he argues that the bedrock of all truth is belief, basically. And he's right? Like there can't be a ground floor between every ground floor. There can't be a proof for every proof, as Lewis said, because the process would go on for eternity. So there has to be something that we just intuitively recognize as truth. So Eric says, all right, Christians, you guys are grounding all of this in the properly basic truth of God, which I would agree. We can't prove God's existence. I can't, do some math like 2 + 2 = 4 and show that to you. But what Eric does is he grounds it as an abstraction. And he has a really good debate I listened to when I was researching for the book, where he basically lays out and said, because the argument against him was, where does this fit in a naturalistic universe? Can I go overturn a rock and find the value of justice? You'd say, well, no, you can't do that. It's an abstract truth. But I have two problems with Eric's view. One is abstractions are always pointing us to some concrete thing, right? Like the idea of 2 + 2 = 4, like those numbers are abstractions for like either two objects, like, if I'm counting things, 2 rocks, okay? For the Christian, all of those abstract truths are grounded in God's nature, right? Something transcendent beyond us. But still, Eric has the same problem. When you try to ground these self-evident truths in reality, in a naturalistic universe, they're still floating in midair. There's nowhere to attach them onto and say, these abstract understandings we have connect to this. The second problem I have with Eric's view is he recognizes the same thing I recognize in a lot of ways, but his worldview contradicts it. Because one of the big things that atheists will point out who hate the idea of self-evident truths is they say, oh, so we can just make up whichever ones we want and just basically it's an a la carte and grab them all. I'm like, well, no. All self-evident truths don't require proof to be proven because you can't prove them, but they have to mesh with your worldview. And if they don't mesh with your worldview, either your worldview is wrong or you got the self-evident truths wrong.
So, and the self-evident truth in Eric Weilenberg's case being these objective fact of morality and meaning and so on.
Justice exists.
And so on. But that it doesn't, as far as you can see, mesh with his worldview because he's got they're floating freely, as it were, without any grounding, as far as you can see. So there seems to be and whereas as far as you're concerned in Christianity, there is this grounding that makes sense of that intuition that so many of us have, that there are these fundamental, ways in which it's right to live life.
Which fits is like with what Nietzsche said about how basically what he said was they're throwing off the Christian God and they're keeping his morality, right? And so I think that's what Eric is doing. He's recognizing these intuitive truths that we have that we've grounded in Christianity and Judaism before that for thousands of years. And he's not ready to let them go because once you see them, they're really hard to unsee.
Where do you go with that, Mike, then?
I think we've been moral for longer than we've been religious as a species, even without counting, pro-social behavior in other animals. I don't think.
Eric, it sounds like what you're saying then, Mike, if you'll forgive me for just a clarification here, is what you're saying then, we've evolved a sense of morality because of its usefulness to procreation and, passing on our DNA and so on. That doesn't sound like an objective type of morality to me.
Yeah, but if it's universal, if all creatures benefit from surviving versus dying, if all creatures, benefit from thriving rather than suffering, if all creatures, benefit from having large families versus small ones, or no offspring at all. At what point, again, I use the term in my chapter in the response book as universal, perhaps rather than objective. I think over time.
That's a helpful distinction for me, because I do think there's probably a difference between those two ways of thinking about morality. Saying something is universal doesn't for me necessarily imply it's objective. It may just be that we all happen to agree on this, but it might still be a subjective form of morality that we.
Except I'd argue that if it's universal, it's true whether you agree with it or not.
Well, I suppose again, then depends on what you mean by universal. But Zach, do you want to speak into that? Do you think there's a difference between what Mike's describing there and objective?
It sounds like universal. Mike, would you say universal is 100% agreement on something? Or I mean,
No, not at all. I'm saying it's real, whether we believe it or not. It's like science. It's, gravity's, is what happens even if you stop believing in gravity. But the idea that
right, that's objective though. How's that different than universal?
I don't think it is. I think that I used to think that it was, well, it's universal, it's close enough. And then in conversation, you said, "Oh my gosh, you believe in objective moral truths," and I go, "Yeah, I do." So, but
can you give me an example? Sorry, go ahead.
Where was I going? I've lost it. Go ahead.
Can you give me an example of an objective moral truth that is true for humans, regardless of whether somebody accepts it or not?
I believe murder is a crime. Murder is wrong.
Okay. So how do you fit that with a Darwinian paradigm with natural selection, survival of the fittest? How do those connect together?
First of all, I'm also an outlier in these topics in that I give more credit to group selection than
that's what I was wondering.
The idea that we exist in community, that those neighbors we're all supposed to love us back. We look after one another and care for one another, and the whole group benefits. If I save the life of my brother's children, it's nearly as good as saving the lives of my own. And I guess that's been discredited at one level or another in evolutionary genetics or whatever, but it makes an intuitive sense. It's one of the reasons that I think religion has been, I believe, evolved into us, is that small groups that had religious beliefs and religious rituals and cared for one another because of some sense that they had were more successful. They lived longer, they resisted disease and privation, and they had more cohesion when faced with outside threats. So again, this idea of, what's the alternative to thriving? It's failure and death. But again, the idea that, survival of the fittest, red in tooth and claw and all that sort of thing. Yeah, that's true. We're all sitting here because our ancestors ate a lot of other living animals. But the idea that we do this by ourselves doesn't make any sense to me, and that we can't do it without others. And so that group selection thing comes back in for me.
The group selection, though, I mean, so you kind of, the way I understood what you just said, correct me if I'm wrong, natural selection has no problems with what you just said as far as looking out for your cousins, those kind of things. It's not just yourself or your immediate kids, it's people carrying your genes. But group selection would say, well, it's not just people carrying your genes, it's everybody. And evolution actually passes on traits that allows us to care for everyone, which it's still called evolution, but you might as well come up with a brand new name for it because it's a completely different understanding. Natural selection is the fuel that drives an evolutionary paradigm. Mm-hmm. So that's the reason why almost universally this idea of group selection has been rejected, because it's almost like coming up with something completely new from Darwinian evolution. And so it sounded to me, Mike, like you were also bouncing between what's pragmatic for a species to continue on and thrive, and what's objectively true for a species, regardless of whether or not it's going to cause them to continue and thrive.
But it's interesting how many of the objective truths are massively pragmatic.
Agreed.
They result in cohesion and survival and group discipline and all that sort of thing. But I've lost my thought. Go ahead.
But if you're going to say, I'm going to care, I have no confusion over natural selection saying, all right, our tribe is going to protect each other because we are all interbreeding, we're all carrying the same genes. That makes sense to me. I have no issues with that. But when you start saying my tribe needs to not slaughter the other tribe and take their stuff, and that's objectively wrong, I'm like, how do you mesh that with an evolutionary view of natural selection? I get how it fits with group selection, but group selection at this point really isn't even on the table. Nobody's kind of going there for the most part, from what I understand. And granted, I've been out of the research on this for probably 4 years. So unless something's changed, let me know. But when I was researching for the book, group selection was kind of like the thing everybody hated in the Darwinian camp. So I can't remember the guy's name, but he said it's up there with like young earth creationists in terms of its respectability.
Yeah. And some scientists and many atheists hate ideas they don't love just as much as believers do. But I guess one of the things we've been doing is expanding our circle as a social animal. We've expanded it to not just from family, but to village, to city, to country, to the planet. Most people would acknowledge at least some sort of connection with every other human being on the planet. Some folks have continued on and say, you know what, that cow looks pretty sad. I don't think I want to eat it. People are beginning to extend appreciation for, I was going to say non-sentient animals, but animals that aren't as sentient perhaps as us. There are people who would like to regard, the great apes as entitled to as many human rights as we do. And we continue, and people love whales, because they what if they're as smart as us? Then we probably shouldn't be, harpooning them. Everyone agrees on that. But the idea that we've expanded this web of responsibility around the entire world to people we've never met and will never meet. The idea that, right now we're dealing with this COVID-19 virus that started in a small, in a big town in a country on the other side of the world I hadn't heard of before, before it started. And now we're all affected by it. So the idea that we're all in it together, that we all have responsibility for one another, feels as obvious as was the properly basic as
obvious as 2 + 2 is 4.
Pretty much.
And I wouldn't disagree. Go ahead, Justin.
Well, all I was going to say was, I hate to break up the party, but we're going to go to a break, and I will come back for that thought, Zach, in just a moment's time. Always the worst part of my job, breaking in on an interesting conversation to go to a break. But we will be back with my guests, Zach Broom and Mike Brady. Zach is the author of Without God, Science, Belief, Morality, and the Meaning of Life. And we're debating the meaning of life, whether there is some ultimate meaning to life. And if so, how are we supposed to find out what it is? That's the show topic today. You're listening to Unbelievable. We'll be back very shortly.
If you listen to Unbelievable with Justin Briley on Premier Christian Radio and enjoy the conversations between Christians and skeptics, then this is the perfect app for you. For the latest updates, podcasts, videos, articles, bonus content and much more, download the Premier Unbelievable app today.
Welcome back to the final part of today's show. Where do atheists get their meaning? We've been asking with my guests Zach Broom and Michael Brady. I'll make sure there are links to both of them from today's show. So if you're watching on the YouTube channel, just go and check the info. And indeed, same if you're on the podcast, wherever you get your podcast from, you'll be able to find links to my guests, including Zach's book, Without God, Science, Belief, Morality, and the Meaning of Life. And we've been talking about the meaning of life on today's show. And inevitably, as these things do, and I fully expected it to, it often comes back to that issue of morality and whether there is an objective yes or no to evil and good and so on in the world, and how we ground that. And I think Mike very eloquently in that last section said, look at this current coronavirus pandemic and the way that the whole world is sort of feeling connected and doing what it takes to make sure that we all look out for each other and make sure that we are, act in that way that is responsible. And he says that seems as obvious and intuitive as any properly basic belief. Therefore, isn't that enough, I suppose, is Michael's question. Do we need to add a God dimension to make sense of that fact that this is the way we flourish, this is the way we get on, this is the way we are human in the world? So where do you go with that, Zach, as we start to bring the strands of today's show together?
I would say This idea of the strong taking care of the weak has not been a universal part of human existence. It's been by far not the norm. And obviously, as a Christian, I ground this in the Christian story, the Christian narrative, which is Christ, who is the second part of the Trinity, all power, all authority, humbles himself, takes upon the form of us, suffers and dies for us. It's the strong becoming weak for the weak. So that idea, I think it is a self-evident truth. I think it is properly basic that it is wrong to harm others, but for all of human history, largely, especially if we pull in the naturalistic worldview into this, that hasn't been the norm. So right now, Mike, obviously, as you know, we've talked about this a lot. I think humanism is riding on Christianity's coattails without the ground floor to keep things nailed down.
You sounded rather like one of my previous guests on the show, Tom Holland, who I don't know if either of you listened to that show with AC Grayling, where he essentially believes, Tom, not coming at it particularly from a Christian perspective on that show, that nonetheless, a lot of what humanists take for granted as these intrinsic beliefs about the way we should treat each other have not been taken for granted by many cultures in the past. It was only really the Christian Revolution that Christianized so much of the West, from which humanism springs. What do you say to that? Are you really? You may have rejected your faith in those years ago, Mike, but you're still a Christian at heart when it comes to your humanism.
Well, raised in a Christian society, whether or not it's post-Christian, as Zach suggested it might be. I don't believe the United States is post-Christian in the way that perhaps Europe or the UK is, in that there's still, very strong religious belief, counterpoised by none or very little, and then all the folks in the middle who attend religious service as needed. But I go back to the concept of essentially part of the Christian story. We want to believe the better story, but part of it holds a rather cynical and dim view of humanity. It regards us as fallen. In some cases, I've heard some people call it diseased by sin, and the idea that we've never been better than we are now. I question that. One of the things I found in my studies that there was a skeleton found of a Neanderthal man who was elderly, and his arm was withered due to unuse because he'd had a stroke. And the idea that he'd been cared for by his family unit for endless years, even though he had very little to contribute, gives lie to the idea of, Og can't hunt, Og gets left outside on the hillside. It didn't play out that way. There were, I think it was a case of a child with a neural tube defect, spina bifida, who lived into adolescence, despite a crippling, disabling, developmental flaw. So we have taken care of our weakest, and it was done by the strongest, especially in an environment where if you weren't strong, you were in trouble. Somebody carried those people around and cared for them, fed them at their own cost. So this idea that we're a sorry lot and we're never going to amount to much except for God, is part of the story. There's a happier part of it, and I enjoy that part. But I guess I go back to Steven Pinker as well. I think you've spoken with Justin, the better angels of our nature. Over the arc of human history, things have never been better. We've improved generation over generation, and we're doing a better job of looking after our neighbor and extending the circle and caring for more people than we ever did or wanted to. And that, in that regard, I wonder if Christianity isn't borrowing from some other philosophy's coattails.
Zach, go ahead.
Which philosophy would be my question?
Yep. And this is where we'd order another round of adult beverages. and carry on the conversation. But
I mean, Mike, I think we got to make one distinction here between caring for our tribe and caring for the other tribe, because you and I have no confusion over why a humanist would say we should care for our own tribe. That's not my criticism. My criticism is, why should tribe A care for tribe B, where according to a Darwinian paradigm with natural selection, wipe out tribe B, take their stuff, take their daughters, that kind of stuff. And there's tons of examples of that in nature, tons of it, right? And there's also tons of that examples in human nature. And it was Christianity that came along and said, or the Judeo-Christian worldview came along and said, no, don't do this. The strong don't get to oppress the weak. In fact, strong, you need to become weak. You need to take care of the weak, even when it is at your expense. And so under your worldview, Mike, I still am not seeing, you're objective, you believe in objective morality now. I don't see how you can ground that self-evident truth with a worldview that says the strong eat the weak, survival of the fittest, nature is red in tooth and claw. It's not completely red in tooth and claw, because we do take care of our own tribe. But when it comes to taking care of the others, those outside of our circle of friends and family, what's the objective ground floor for doing that? Because if you're going to ground these beliefs in self-evident truth, you have to mesh it with your worldview. And I still don't see how those fit together. In Christianity, they do. Christianity might be wrong. Okay, I don't think it is. But at least there's no conflict of meshing the two together. Whereas with humanism and objective moral truths, in purpose, I don't see how they fit.
Okay. And again, the idea of, I've been offered a variety of labels on this conversation. One of them is humanist. The other is Darwinist. Darwin had a really good idea. It's been built on by generations of people a lot, as smart or smarter than him. The idea of, everyone, that Christianity has a better plan. I think the New Testament probably has a slightly better plan. But one of the things we talked about in the
unless you read Revelation.
Well, okay, that plan's not quite so happy. Interesting, but
I think you'd like that one.
But well, I've read it, and I didn't like it. But the Old Testament, talk about red in tooth and claw. Like, you better, you're worried about, future Christians, coming along and caring for their tribe. You better not be a Canaanite. So the idea that, caring for others, runs, all the way through the Bible, not so much. A lot of behaviors were not only tolerated but ordered by this, moral and meaning-giving deity that resulted in a lot of people being massacred.
Do you want to respond to that, Zach? It's a whole extra can of worms we'll be opening right at the end, but
probably not going to completely open the can of words of justifying the actions in the Old Testament. That's probably longer than a 5-minute response here. It's a whole different conversation.
Well, we could have that conversation another time, but yeah. I guess Mike's overall point is, that he seems to want to see, as far as I can see, that there is a kind of a natural instinct somehow in humanity to care for the other. You say, actually, that's not a natural instinct. It's something that we've been given by the Christian worldview historically. And that if we do think that that is the way life should therefore be lived, it has to come from somewhere beyond us, because it's not actually natural to us. It's not somehow inherent within us that this is the way life should be lived. And indeed, there are lots of people who do end up living their life in other ways and having other ways of seeing the world and meaning and so on. But if there is a real way that we should see meaning and life and purpose, then for you, Zach, the only way you can ground that obviously is in a God who has made us for such a life and such a purpose and such a meaning. I feel like we've come back a little bit in that sense to the fact that in the end, you simply can't see how you can have that kind of a view on an atheistic worldview, presumably, Zach. You don't believe you can believe in a single way of life that is the way that we're made for, in the absence of a creator who made us for such a life. Is that kind of where we land up in the end?
I think so, because if you claim like Eric and Mike would, that these are objective truths, something has to give way. Either your worldview needs to change, which is the temptation to embrace group selection and other things like that, which are majorly taboo right now, or you have to say these intuitions are wrong. And I believe humans, especially now, really struggle to do that, because once you've seen the truth on these things, it's really hard to unsee them in a lot of ways. So for Mike, the question is, well, in the Old Testament, and I'm not trying to open that can of worms up, but I think that's a good contrast, because in the Old Testament, Mike, it's like, oh, that's bad, we can't do that. And then in the New Testament, you see that contrast with Christ, where the tribalism is way less, right? So it's not a universal, even in Judaism, like it's pretty bloody at times, right, in the Old Testament. So I don't think we can say this is a universal thing, because, I mean, granted, I would argue, if we were going to have this argument, short version, I would just say is the Old Testament and what Israel did was miles ahead of the peoples around them in terms of justice and being merciful, even as unmerciful as they were at times. So I think if we look at the big picture of humanity as a whole, it's a bloody mess. And then along comes Christ, the second person of the Godhead, who comes down, humbles himself, is born like us, suffers and dies like us. And that's our example for how to treat others, to how to treat people outside of our tribe. And the motive for it is because God came to us who were outside of his tribe because of, sin and falling away from him. And he brought us back into his tribe through Christ's suffering and death. And for me, that's where meaning comes from.
And that's the best story. And I appreciate that. Yeah, and I get that. I think the foundation for that better story involves a lot more contradictions than we have time to unpack. But I go back to Eric Wielenberg, and again, you're the one who turned me on to him. I don't think that he has to rationalize much. The other thing we can do with an eraser is simply remove the unnecessary layer of God between us and this essential truth around morality being a brute fact in the universe, is erase the story of a God that said, oh, by the way, here's all your rules. If the rules are already there, we don't have to have the God to tell us what they are.
Mm-hmm. I'm going to say that wrong, but Euthyphro's dilemma, basically, like where do these come from? And I reject the idea that God just arbitrarily kicks out whatever he feels like. And I also reject the other horn, which is that God is merely the middleman between morality, right? Yeah. So if God, according to the Christian worldview, is the unchanging, unmoved mover, he doesn't change. He's the same yesterday, today, and forever. What he dictates for moral truth comes from goodness, which is himself, which doesn't change. So it's a false dichotomy. It's a false dilemma.
We're going to have to leave it there, I'm afraid. Much as I would love to pursue some of these rabbit trails a bit further, I feel our time is coming to an end. If we were down in the pub or the bar or whatever the US equivalent is of these things, we would have probably a few more rounds to keep going. But sadly, we're all in, social isolating at the moment, and we can't do that. But nonetheless, I do hope that you guys will continue to keep the conversations going. I've enjoyed being part of it today. Thank you very much for the book that emerged from it as well, Zach. I really enjoyed reading it. So I'll make sure there's links from today's show to it. And of course, to the one that you contributed to as well, Mike, to the Still Unbelievable response book as well. And of course, your own website. So, but for the moment, thank you, gentlemen, both for being on the show with me today.
Thank you.
Thank you both for a very wonderful time. I really enjoyed it.
I enjoyed it.
For more conversations between Christians and skeptics, subscribe to the Unbelievable podcast. And for more updates and bonus content, sign up to the Unbelievable newsletter.